Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are doing my July wrap-up. I have read 8 books, which is the most I have read since April 2020. And I feel like that is the most accurate representation of my mental state that I can give you at this current date. So yeah, I needed this, okay? I needed these books. I was doing a lot of rereading this month. So let's get started with the wrap-up. The first book I read this month was Bonjour, Tristesse. I don't know French, we've been over this, by Françoise Sagan. And this is a relatively short novel about a young girl called Cicely. She's not that young, she's a teenager. And she goes on summer vacation in the south of France with her father and his girlfriend of the month. He kind of goes through, and like other people go through underwear, and she's super used to it. She doesn't really mind it, and she just thinks they're going to have a grand old time. Except then Anne shows up, and Anne is an old friend of her mother's who has taken care of Cicely in the past. So I think Cicely lived with her for a couple of years, and Anne is very unlike the usual woman that his father brings into their life. She's very serious and stern, and unexpectedly her father and Anne fall in love, and this is naturally the worst thing that possibly could ever happen to a half orphan, that their parent falls in love and is suddenly happy with someone. Weird. She decides to sabotage the whole affair and drama ensues. So I think you can tell from the summary that the characters are all very obnoxious, especially Cicely and her father. She describes them as being, lazy and going through life in the most convenient of ways and never really having any regard for other people's feelings and thoughts, and just living in a way that's the most comfortable to them without really considering what they're leaving in their wake. And even Anne, who is quite unlike that, still is quite obnoxious in the way that she seems to feel herself to be so superior to Cicely and Cicely's father. But the book still felt very accurate to being an actual teenager, in the way that, like, Anne and her father want to get married, and so, that would mean that Anne would come to live with them, and Cicely's like, this is so dramatic, my whole life is going to change, when realistically, like, she's almost an adult. Like, her life was bound to change in a couple of years anyway, and she won't even live with them super long into their married life, but it still feels so grave to her that this change is occurring. There's also kind of a romance subplot. It's a little bit weird that's going on with Cicely, and she really acts just very obnoxiously towards that guy as well, and it's just, she's very selfish, but in a way that I feel like most teens at one point or another are selfish. So I didn't hate her for it, I just saw it for what it is, which is a teenage girl that felt her life was kind of being uprooted. Also, the father, no. Unfortunately not. Like, this, why are men? You know what I mean? Like, why are fathers? He is a terrible father. Not, like, I think it's alright if you're living, like, a very obnoxious lifestyle and you're just going through women like other people go through underwear, and you just talk with a bunch of obnoxious people all day, every day, that think that you and them are so much better than the rest of society. Whatever. But, like, he's just an objectively nonchalant father. Like, he doesn't care what happens to Cicely, and he really just blows whatever, like, he really just goes whatever way the wind blows, and it's so annoying. And, like, Anne, like, objectively does some things and says some things to Cicely that are not okay, and her father doesn't say anything about that. Like, her father doesn't seem to care that his partner is treating his own daughter unfairly. And it's, in my opinion, the reason that the whole situation escalates in the way that it does escalate. And if it weren't for him, they all could have just been happy. But he was there, so you know what you're gonna do. Okay, I would recommend this book specifically to people that liked Call Me By Your Name, and that also think, like, only if both of these things are true. If you think that you're charismatic enough to carry yourself in high society despite the fact that you don't have any money or status or whatever, but you just believe in yourself that, yeah, you could definitely be friends with Blair Waldorf and Chuck Bass because you're just that smart and that charismatic. If you think that's you, then this book is for you. And you shouldn't read this book if going on vacation and just staying in bed like until noon and then getting up, having breakfast, and just laying in the sun on the beach all day till dinner. If that sounds like a horrible vacation to you, don't read this book. If it sounds like a fun vacation to you, check it out. Next up, we have Businessmen as Lovers by Rosemary Tonks. This book is kind of the surprise of the month for me, if you will. It is a romance literary fiction book from like the 1960s. 1969. And it is about two girly pops going on vacation in Italy with a bunch of their friends, and one of them has a family, so her family is there as well. And it's just summer vacation shenanigans. Nothing really happens, and I loved it. I genuinely think this is one of the best and most compelling things I've read so far this year. It was so funny, and I loved the relationships between all the women in this book. Like, one of them is married to a wealthy businessman, and she has his babies, and she lives what, you know, many people would call the ideal family life. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have an ex-prostitute who's currently dating one of the other characters in this book. And the third friend is kind of in the middle of that. And so these women are all very different, and they're treated very differently in their society, in my opinion. But they just support each other so well, and they really care for each other. And you can really tell that the female friendship is at the heart of this novel, even though it is a romance, and I really liked the romance. In my opinion, the friendship is what carried this novel. I would recommend this book to women. If you are a woman, I think this book is so great because, in my opinion, it's always very healing to read older books / classics that depict women in a good light and that show the support that women had for each other. Because I feel like we're often fed this narrative that up until like 2 years ago, women were only pitted against each other and they were 100% dependent on the men that they were dating. In this book, the women are definitely their own characters, and the fact that it's already over 50 years old is, in my opinion, just very healing and really fun, and it really like puts things into perspective because, like, as a woman who hasn't lived in this period of time, all I know about it is what I consume in media and learn in history class, and that is often very limited because, let's face it, history classes don't care about women. Also, read this if you think a summer in Italy is all you need to get your life together, and if you think that the way men were expected to act, especially in the 20th century, kind of as like the breadwinner and very masculine and very distanced from their families in order to properly provide for them, if you just find that kind of cringe and a little bit hilarious when men actually act like it, also read this book because the women in this find it funny. And I found it funny that they found it funny. And don't read it if you are quite the cynic when it comes to romance. As I said, the romance isn't what carries this book, but in my opinion, it was done beautifully because it was very raw and very, I want to say, intimate. Like, between the characters, they were very real with each other, but it was still just a smaller subplot. So if you're a cynic when it comes to romance and you don't actually like people being happy in their romantic relationships, don't read this. Don't rain on my parade. Also, fun fact, this book only has like 100 ratings on Goodreads. Or like, no, it is shelved 100 times. It only has like 30 ratings, I want to say, which is such a shame because it was so good. And also, I googled the author afterwards when I noticed how niche this book was apparently, and that was a rabbit hole. I'd high-key recommend you Google Rosemary Tonks. To summarize it for you, essentially, right after she finished this book, in the early 70s, she kind of went insane. I'm not saying that to belittle her. I respect insane women, but she goes into fundamental Christianity. She starts isolating herself. She gets baptized in Jerusalem, and then she starts stealing her books from bookstores and libraries and burns them because they are a symbol of who she was before she was reborn. It is quite the rabbit hole, but I'd high-key recommend looking into her. It is very interesting and fascinating. Next up, we have, I didn't read them back to back, but I'm just grouping them here together, Killer Instinct and All In by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. So these are the sequels to The Naturals by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. The first one being about Cassie, she's not a young girl, she's 16, I don't know why I keep saying that. She is a girl who lives with her father's family. Her father's quite estranged, he's in the military, she never sees him, and her mother a couple of years ago was brutally murdered, and at least the police presumes that she was because of all the blood, but they never actually found the body. And Cassie has been kind of trying to cope with that because she was the one that found all that blood in her mother's dressing room. And Cassie also has a special ability to read people. And one day, out of nowhere, kind of, she is approached by the FBI. Yeah, like in the Federal Bureau of Investigation of the United States of America. And they're like, we have a program. And Cassie is like, what the hell, man? What the hell? They have a program for gifted teens to help solve cold cases. And they approach Cassie and ask if she would like to join. And at first she's a little bit hesitant, but she ultimately decides to do it because she hopes that she can use this program and its assets to solve her mother's murder. And that's kind of what the first book is about, and every book has kind of one central mystery that all relates to one of the other characters. So in my opinion, neither one of these books was as good as the first one. I really, really loved the first one. When I initially finished it, I rated it 5 stars, which, like, looking back, okay, that was a bit optimistic, but I still really enjoyed it. I think I landed on a 4.5. I rated the second one a 3.75 and the third one a 4 star, which is by no means bad, and I still really enjoyed them. With the second book specifically, I found the pacing quite odd, to be completely honest with you. Like, for a majority of this book, I thought that it was setting up like a multiple book arc, right? Like, I thought, okay, we are getting introduced to all of this now, and then we are going to spend at least the second and third book on this one mystery, which would have been fine in my opinion, and she could have done that. But the setup for the second book felt so long. Like, I feel like it only started to pick up about 60% through the book. And I can't really pinpoint why exactly that is, why I felt this way, but I did. And it was very off-putting and kind of the reason why I didn't enjoy it as much. And then the third one was, in my opinion, the most brutal one yet. Like, the second one is definitely more graphic, but I feel like the third one was the most unsettling to me. And I was like, as I said, this month has been quite the month for me. I was mentally not in my most stable of states, okay? And when I tell you, I thought this book would end me. Like, multiple times, I genuinely thought I wouldn't make it through to the other side. Because it was just... The third book, specifically, we get so much more insight into the other characters that we never really delved into before. And we get a lot of their backstories, and they're also just a lot more relevant to the plot. And just seeing that and seeing them in this dangerous mystery and being entangled in that was just very upsetting to me. And also the conclusion was so unsettling in my opinion, which is a good thing. Like, this is a YA thriller mystery. It's supposed to be compelling and unsettling, I suppose, but it was still hard to read for me, which is also why I'm kind of taking a break from the series for a second. And I also, personally, I don't love where we're going with the love triangle. There's a very compelling love triangle in the series, and I think for a lot of people that's kind of a draw. Famously, Jennifer Lynn Barnes also wrote the Natural series, and as we all know, there is one of the most intriguing love triangles of the decade, I would say, in that book. And she does it in this one as well. I'd recommend the series to anyone who likes fun. Like, if you like to have fun, give this series a shot. There's really, you have nothing to lose. I do have to say, don't read the series if, like, you don't think you can get past the ridiculousness. Because, as I said, it's teenagers working for the FBI to solve murder cases. It is a little bit ridiculous. And if you don't think you can look past that idiotic setup, you won't have a good time. You'll be caught up. But if you're one of those go with the flow readers, you don't really care, you're very willing to accept stupid things in books, I think this is a great old time. I also think that this is like the series to get out of a reading slump. Like, I just think these books are so fast-paced. I usually finish them within like 2 days. These books are so fast-paced. The characters are so lovable and compelling. The mysteries are really interesting and keep you on your toes. If you're in a reading slump and you like mystery even a little bit, I think this is the series to read. Next up, I read The Moving Finger by Agatha Christie. This is technically a Miss Marple mystery. I'm saying technically because she's barely in this. If you're expecting a classic Miss Marple mystery, you'll be a little bit disappointed. For the most part, I actually thought that I had gotten like a misprint where they put like the wrong cover into the wrong book or something, because she wasn't in it and I was so confused. She is in it eventually, but it takes a second and most of the mystery unfolds long before she ever comes onto the page. And that's completely fine. It was just very distracting to me because like I was the entire time I was like, when's Miss Marple showing up? Where's Jane Marple? Why isn't Miss Marple here? And so that distracted me a little bit from the actual mystery, but I still enjoyed my time here. So this book doesn't focus on Miss Marple. It focuses on 2 siblings, and one of them, I have already forgotten his name. He is a pilot, I believe, and he had a bad accident prior to the events of this book. And so his doctor recommends taking it slow, going to some quaint little village and just staying there until he's completely recovered. And so the main character and his sister decide to move to Limestock and just live their small town fiction dreams, I guess. And it doesn't go over too well for them because like very shortly after they move there, they receive a letter that basically accuses them of not being brother and sister. And they're like, that's weird. Like, why would anyone? And then they just assume that like, okay, yeah, the new guys in town, no one likes strangers, whatever. Except they find out that a lot of people in the village have been getting letters like that, just random accusations that seemingly aren't true, but people obviously can't be sure of that, and so on and so forth. And then eventually someone dies. And that's kind of where we're going. And they're obviously trying to figure out who's sending these letters, if the body is related to these events, and it's all fun and games. So I personally really like the character relationships, specifically the sister and brother relationship in this. Joanna, the sister, is probably one of my favorite Agatha Christie characters of all time. She's a very modern woman, and she's kind of the odd one out in this very traditional and somewhat backward village. And like people constantly ask her questions about her lifestyle, or they ask her brother about her lifestyle, and he's like, I don't know, man, like she's just living. And I thought that was really fun because it's never done in an accusatory way, in my opinion. It's just people find her odd. And I also really liked all the dynamics within the village. Like you could really tell that how quickly people were willing to turn on each other once these letters started to roll in. And that was really interesting in my opinion. And I just in general think that obviously the Miss Marple mysteries specifically heavily rely on the character relationships. And I just think that this is just another very good example of that. And creating such an alive network of people is quite the feat in 200 pages in my opinion. I find it hard to recommend Agatha Christie. Like if you like mystery, reading her novels is just a rite of passage in my opinion. If you've never read a Miss Marple mystery but you've been wanting to get into it, I wouldn't recommend getting this one just because it isn't really a Miss Marple mystery. But I do think if you've liked Miss Marple previously, this is as good a book as any to pick up. I rated this 3.5 stars. I enjoyed my time here. I'll probably reread it in like 10 years time, but until then I won't be thinking about it much. And then the reading shifted quite a bit for me. I kind of got into my rereading era. As I said, I've been having a rough time in July. I know I've been saying it a lot in this video, but it's true, and I really need to emphasize that. And so one thing that I really like to do when I'm not feeling great is reread books, just because I find it super comforting, and I can already, like, I know exactly what I'm going to get out of the book, and it's just very comforting and calming to me. And so I reread Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. I like how when I hold the books up like this, the lamp like illuminates them from the back. So, the Chamber of Secrets and we have a little bit of a complicated relationship with each other. Let me tell you why. In 6th grade, we read this novel in school. I think my classmates read the first one in 5th grade, but I wasn't in that class in 5th grade, so I never even read the first one before reading this one. And it was a school assignment. And like, listen, our teacher did so well. Like, as I was reading this, I remembered some of the assignments we had to do for this book, and she was so creative with it. She gave us so much creative liberty. She really, like, drove home the point that literary analysis and spending time with the text should be a fun activity and should teach you something. And she, no blame to her, okay, but it was a school assignment, and I just remember sitting in my bed at night having to read these super long chapters before each class, because it wasn't like, oh, you need to read this book by X date and then we're going to talk about it. We like read it alongside each other, kind of as a buddy read almost, where we just had to read like 2 chapters a week or something. And so oftentimes I would just forget, and so just reading these 30 to 40 page long chapters, it would always take like an hour or something, because I had to take notes and do the school assignments and all of it. It was just miserable. It was a miserable time. And that is the reason I have never reread The Chamber of Secrets before, and it was fine. But I was like, you know what? This is the time, because last year in November I had COVID, and so I reread the first one, and then I was like, okay, you know what? Harry and I, we have a date with destiny, okay? And so I reread it, and surprisingly enough, this is a great book. Like, I really was being so unfair to it. It is the sequel to Harry Potter. I don't know what else. Like, if you don't know what Harry Potter is about at this point, I can't help you. Yeah, it was a great book. I had a grand old time. It was so fun. It was also, I was shocked by how much I remembered, which I guess makes sense considering how in detail we went over this book, but it was just still so shocking to me for some reason. But yeah, I had fun. I really like how innocent and young this book still feels, because the series gets quite dark quite quickly as you go on. And so reading the first 2-3 books is a very different experience than the rest of the series, in my opinion. Getting just more of this childlike wonder in the Harry Potter series, knowing how dark it's going to turn, it was just so nice. You know what I mean? It was just so nice to just see them be happy and wander around the castle, and there's still stakes in this book. Like, this isn't low stakes by any means, but compared to the rest of the series, it kind of is. And that was just very liberating, in my opinion, like not having to worry about all of these world encompassing issues yet. So yeah, I enjoyed my time here. I kind of want to reread the rest of the series, but I don't know if I actually will yet. But for what it was a good time, and I'm very glad that I read it. And then I went on to reread Howls Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. So I actually watched the movie for the first time this year, because there was a rerun of it at a local theater. So I actually got to watch it in theater, which was so cool. And all I knew about the difference between the movies and the books, that people say the movie is so different, and it's like the plot is completely different, the book is a whole new experience, yada yada yada. And I've read this book, I think, in 2021, 2022. It's already been a second. And so I couldn't remember too much of the book, but as I was watching the movie, I was like, that sounds familiar. Like, I feel like that's exactly what happens in the book. And so basically I gaslighted myself that I needed to reread this. And honestly, I was kind of right. Like, it is kind of the same thing as the movie. It's also very different to the movie, but a lot of the central themes and plots and messages are the same, but they are just planted in very different storylines. You know what I mean? I don't feel like I'm explaining this very well, but anyway. This book follows young Sophie, who one day is cursed by a witch, and suddenly she's not so young. She is, in fact, an old woman. And so Sophie packs her bags and decides, I can't go on. Like, my family can't see me like this. I'm no use like this. And she wanders out of the town and ends up at Howls Moving Castle. Howl is a notorious wizard that in the town is known to be eating girls' souls and hearts. Eating their hearts and trapping their souls, or something like that. And Sophie's like, well, I'm not a young girl. He won't be interested in me. Maybe he can help me with my curse. And so she basically invites herself in, and we continue on from there. I don't really want to say anymore because that's really all you need to know to enjoy this book. Like, to understand whether you would enjoy this book. And it's so cute. It's so fun. And if you like Studio Ghibli movies in general, if you like Howl's Moving Castle, the movie, I'd really recommend you check out the book, because it is different enough that reading it is not boring if you've already seen the movie, but the vibes and a lot of the themes are still similar enough that you kind of already have an idea what you're getting into when you're picking this up. So if you're looking for like a cozy fantasy, especially in like spring and summertime, I think this is just a great one to go with. One more thing I want to add to this, which I forgot to say in the beginning. Howl's Moving Castle is my favorite fantasy novel. If you know anything about me as a reader, you'll know that I'm not a big fantasy girly, despite the fact that basically all you can see from my bookshelf right now is my fantasy books. I don't really love fantasy, and this is the only fantasy book I have ever rated 5 stars. And to be honest, I didn't enjoy myself as much on this reread, and I'm not sure why that is. I feel like I kind of forced myself to finish it, even though I was realizing that I'm not feeling it particularly. And I think that just negatively impacted me. I really wanted to see how like the story progressed, which is why I wanted to finish it. But at the same time, I already knew that I didn't have a great time whilst reading this. So yeah, I didn't end up rating this reread and just stuck with the 5 stars that I gave it for the first time that I read it. But I was a little bit sad anyway. And then, oh god. Okay, the last book of the month was Winter by Marissa Meyer. This is quite the book. This book is over 800 pages long. And last year, I kind of went into a frenzy and reread the first 3 books. And I also, for the first time, read Ferris, which is like a novella that comes between the 3rd and 4th book. And I don't think Ferris was ever translated to German, so I didn't even know it existed until the reread last year. But then my semester started, and this is a very long book. I got up till here. So that was like 70 pages or something. Exactly 70 pages. I can't really tell you anything about the plot, obviously, because it's the 4th and last book in the series. But the series itself follows, in the first book at least, a girl named Cinda. She's a mechanic from New Beijing. This is a sci-fi series. We are like 500 years into the future. And she's a cyborg. And in this society, cyborgs are treated quite poorly. There has been a pandemic ravaging over the entire planet of Earth. And in order to find a cure, the governments of different countries have started experimenting on cyborgs. And so in New Beijing, where Cinda lives, every week or so, cyborgs are drawn in and they're medically experimented on until they die. And obviously Cinda is quite unsettled by this, and eventually she is given up by her legal guardian. She's given up to go into this medical facility, but oh, turns out she is immune to this disease that has 100% kill rate. Turns out Cinda is from the moon colony Luna, which used to be an earthen colony, but by now it's like its own separate society with like its own separate government, and people on Luna have special abilities, at least a lot of them. And they're also quite isolated. Their queen is a little bit of a tyrant, and Lunarians aren't really allowed to be on Earth. Like, they aren't really legally allowed to leave Luna. Earthens are also quite wary of them because one of their special abilities of the Lunarians is that they can compel people and disillusion people. So they can make themselves look differently, they can make themselves talk differently, they can force other people to do certain things. They are supposed to be cruel on planet Earth, which is why they aren't really allowed or welcome there either. And the story kind of spirals from there. Each of these books is a fairy tale retelling. Obviously, the first one is Cinderella. And the first book is honestly quite weak, especially compared to the rest of the series, in my opinion. The plot is just very predictable, and the series honestly lives off of the character relationships. And there aren't that many of those in the first book yet. Like, they don't really develop until the second half of the second book. But once you get there, the series really gets good. Like, I genuinely think the series held up for me. Okay, so now for winter. Again, I'll be quick. Very long book. Easily could have been 100 pages shorter. Sorry, not sorry. This was just a lot. What I do have to say, so in each book we follow a new different main character and her love interest. And so by the time this book ends, we have like 10 ongoing POVs. And it was so cool seeing all of these POVs kind of finally come together. Like, it almost felt like I was reading Avengers Endgame. Like, all of these characters that have been working since book 1 to get where they're in this book now, and they've been working out plans over and over for multiple books now, and from all different sides they're now coming together to kind of defeat the big bad of the series. And it was so cool. I honestly feel a little bit empty after finishing this series. I was really honestly enjoying my reread more than reading them for the first time when I was like 15. Here's the thing. Would I recommend this series? I don't know. I've thought long and hard on this. I do not know whether or not to recommend it. On the one hand, I think for what it is, for sci-fi fairy tale retellings, if that sounds compelling to you, absolutely pick it up. It is exactly what you would expect from that premise. And despite the fact that the first book is quite weak, the series only grows stronger with every novel. And there's such a jump in quality from the first to the second book, in my opinion. So if you've been thinking about picking this up, I wouldn't discourage you. However, there's something to be said for this series is like 10 years old. Is it like all that this series does, people after have probably done again, and they in books that are newer, that are maybe still more relevant, that maybe have a bigger fan base at the moment, where I'm just like, I don't know that you need to read this particular series. Thank you all so much for sticking around for this video. It is quite the long one. I'm looking at almost 60 minutes of raw footage, which is going to be so much fun to edit. But yeah, thank you for sticking around. Let me know your favorite book of July, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and if you do, I'll see you in next week's video. Bye!